Fruitfulness. What does it mean to bear fruit? Much fruit, as Jesus states. And what is this fruit that we're asked to bear? In Western New York, it is still cold, and bearing any kind of fruit is out of season. It's months away, unless you have a temperature and light-controlled greenhouse on your property. But here, in the arrangement of the liturgical year, we have the call to bear fruit, and now. On Easter, the Feast of the Resurrection, we heard the story again that Christ is not in the tomb, but has risen. And then on the next 2 Sundays after that, we listened as the first witnesses recount how they indeed saw the risen and living Lord. And then did you notice a shift last Sunday? The gospel accounts changed to how we live out the resurrection, how to listen to the Lord's voice, how to live in close connection to Jesus every day. There's an emphasis now on how the resurrection continues to impact lives. If it were just an historical event without any continuing consequences, or if the resurrection were merely a doctrinal statement, we hold the resurrection to be true, those would be important starting points. But how the risen Lord still speaks to people, how the message of the resurrection still has power to deliver us from slavery to sin and death, how the resurrection points to God's recreation that is underway because of Christ's victory. That is why Easter continues. That is where we find ourselves in the grand story of redemption. Easter is not a one-day celebration, and Easter is not even a short season. Easter is a way of being where we live and move and have our being. As one commentator wrote, the resurrection is a reality that compels the church forward in history, forward to share the message that life wins the day, forward by the Holy Spirit's leading, forward to bear fruit, fruit that lasts. In Acts, just previous to our reading, we find that Philip was in Samaria preaching the resurrection, and according to how we would judge a fruitful ministry today, then Philip could be a poster boy for that. Crowds were listening with one accord. They were eager to hear his message. Signs and wonders were happening. Unclean spirits were coming out of the possessed, and there were healings and great miracles happening. People coming to faith in the resurrected Lord. Fruitful ministry. And there was great joy in the city because of all that was happening. And news of the success of what was happening in Samaria had reached Jerusalem. So Peter and John went to see just what was going on, what this was all about. But before Philip could sit down and write a best-selling book on church growth, the Spirit spoke to him. And the Spirit said something surprising. Travel south on this desert wilderness road, away from the crowds, away from the fruits of his ministry that were so obvious in Samaria. It's odd, isn't it, that no superintendent in the Free Methodist Church or others, or bishop today, would feel comfortable sending a successful pastor in one place where they're seeing the fruit of the Spirit moving away to a place that was lonely and that was dry, a wilderness, desert place. But Philip was called away, and the passage takes special care to note that it is a desert place, a lonely place. There are no crowds there to hear. And Philip may have wondered exactly why am I here in this moment. But, oh, hey, up ahead there's a chariot. So pick up your pace, Philip, and see if that's why you're here. And Philip follows those spirit promptings. And as he draws closer, he hears an Ethiopian man reading from Isaiah. And reading aloud was usually how reading was done in those times. You didn't read to yourself as we often do today. And again, prompted by the Spirit, Philip asked him, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And the man's answer was, How can I unless someone guides me? So Philip does guide him to hear that passage read that spoke prophetically about Jesus, the resurrected Lord. The man had been in Jerusalem, it says, to worship and was heading home to Ethiopia. And Ethiopia might not look exactly like it looks on our maps today, but it's a more general area of that part of the world that probably included present-day Sudan and South Sudan and maybe other areas as well. But it's that part of the world. And he's gone all the way to Jerusalem to worship, but as a eunuch, he would not have been allowed access to full worship. He would not have ever have had the chance to be engrafted into Israel as a full Israelite. But here, as he travels home and reads from the prophet Isaiah, God's Spirit leads Philip right to him. He, the Ethiopian man, is reading of Christ's sacrificial death, like a lamb led to slaughter. And he reads, "Justice was denied him, and who can describe his generation? Children. For his life was taken away from the earth." And he relates to this reading as if he's reading from his own life. Who could speak of his own children? He was never to be a father. That was an impossibility to him. Because Philip is sent to him, he finds the answer to his heartfelt needs, the dryness of his own life, his questions, his place in life. He had been excluded by his circumstances, but no longer would he need to be excluded from Christ. He was met by God through Philip in that dryness, a wilderness, a desert place. But his questions are answered, and he heard that he could be accepted and that he could be fruitful. While he never could be engrafted into the vine that is Israel because of the laws there, he could be engrafted into Christ. He could be accepted. His third question to Philip is, what is to prevent me from being baptized? There's water for baptism on that desert road in God's timing and God's placement. Isn't that amazing? That God so ordained the circumstances that even there would be what was necessary for baptism. The Genesis Conference recently sent a group of people to Senegal to minister there to pastors there that wish to become Free Methodists and their house churches. And in those house churches, there's less than a dozen, 11 I think. There were 151 people waiting to be baptized. Over the last 2 weeks, that team that went from the Genesis Conference to that desert place, if you know anything about Senegal, you know that it is hot and dry and a desert place. It's dry physically, it's dark spiritually. 96% of the population is Muslim there. And the gospel of the Lord has just taken root there. And these people that are proclaiming the resurrection are finding that the hearts there are hungry to hear it. And so they had 151 baptisms this week. And I wondered, how are they going to do baptisms, because there's not pools and there are not outside water ponds or rivers because it is such a dry place. So pictures back from the baptisms that happened there were so precious to me. There was on this side a big bucket of water, and on this side a big bucket of water, and one of the pastors standing in front, whoever was going to be baptized, put their head over an empty bucket, and one swoop of water was like what you'd have in a kitchen container, a small container to boil an egg in, was scooped up and poured over the head of that person. And then everybody in the background is rejoicing. There were baptisms there. There was water. But here on this dry road, God was the one that provided a way. And the eunuch said, what is to prevent me from being baptized? Is there any reason, all of these reasons that I've heard why I can't be engrafted into Israel, are any of those reasons to keep me away from the connection to Christ? And the answer was a resounding no. A resounding no because none of those things mattered, but also a resounding no because God himself had heard the prayer of this Ethiopian man and took Philip away from what we would call a very fruitful ministry onto this lonely road just for him. And this Ethiopian eunuch, unable to father children of his own, finds a fruitfulness beyond his imagination. Tradition says that this story is what brought Christianity to Ethiopia, which was the largest pre-colonial church in Africa, and it still exists today. There is persecution there today, and we need to lift up our brothers and sisters there, but it still exists today. There's no documentation that proves to us that this Ethiopian eunuch was the one that brought Christianity to Ethiopia, but I believe it is. I believe because against all probability and against all human possibility, God heard someone reading something that they didn't understand, something they connected with, and sent Philip there by the Spirit to share the good news of the resurrection to just one seeker, to leave the crowds behind, at least temporarily. Fruitfulness. The eunuch, like a branch, spread out from the vine and carried that message farther and farther until new branches were founded, but one vine. There is only one vine. Exact fruit or measurement of how we would measure fruitfulness defies human understanding, because divine action and will can never be measured by human means. There are different currencies and there are different timetables than what we normally look at. I think of Christ impressed by the widow's mite because it was all to her and she gave it, and that little offering was noticed by Christ as something huge. And so, no, we don't measure in the same way. The Ethiopian man's story reminds us that God looks with holy possibilities at those whom others would dismiss, who seem fruitless. And who is fruitless today in our own world's estimation? The elderly sometimes, people with disabilities, the poor, the sick, the disenfranchised. These are just the sort of people that God takes delight in making them fruitful. And it's not something that we muster up. Today, I think I'll go out and be fruitful for God. It is simply living close to the vine and letting that life from the vine flow through us. Abide. Stay connected. That is where God extends the power and the life of the resurrection. Philip's obedience to follow the Spirit's leading took the life of the resurrection to a people that he would never meet. He could have stayed in Samaria ministering well, but he answered a different call of the Spirit. In gardening, I'm a poor pruner. I can lop off anything that looks dead, but if there's anything that has a blossom or a sign of life on it, I have a really hard time bringing myself to cut those off. But in plants, just in our own lives, there's only so much energy, so much life-giving sap and nutrients flowing, and the plant works hard to send help out to every part, and it makes for a small yield of fruit. We cannot always know what will be most fruitful, and so we're called to trust God in that, to prune our lives and direct the flow of love and life through us. Now, the pruning of God, no matter what you may have heard or people may have, without compassion, said to you, it is never done capriciously or vengefully, but only in love, only with life and focus as the goal. Not every sign of life can capture my full attention. There's just not enough of me, and there's not enough of you either. And so we must choose sometimes the better over the good, and sometimes the best over the better. But it's hard to do that. And so we lay it with God, that God's ministry of pruning does that for us. But reading these passages this week, I was struck, but while pruning is necessary, it stings a bit. But it is also felt by Jesus, because Jesus is the vine to whom we're attached. Jesus is with us, feeling the life we share, feeling also our pains. God's purpose for us is to feel the resurrection life pulsating through us and bringing hope and the transforming graces of Christ to a world so much in need. We see God's story unfolding from the moment the resurrection is proclaimed to the witnesses of that, to what the resurrection story is doing today. It still is unfolding. And covenant promises of God are being kept. And Christ's victory is our victory over sin and over death. And the Spirit's movement is still active in the world. Now, some days I feel that, and I rejoice when I see that happening. And other days, I hardly have a sense of God's ongoing forward movement toward the recreation of his creation. I feel pulled down by the news of the local and world events that shout out of the continuing force of sin in the world and death. Whether we feel it or not, reality has been changed by the resurrection. As we stay close to the vine, God is calling us to love and bear the resurrection message even further and farther than our own imaginations could dream of. Possibilities, maybe even Ethiopia, maybe even what's happening in Senegal, as we abide in the vine.